Hello. So I read the first part, beginning of Scrooge, and at that point, Scrooge had locked up his shop and left, and Bob Cratchit had headed home. And we'll start with the next part of the story. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge. The other rooms being all let out as office space. Now there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. Yet Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face had a dismal light about it. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up upon its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred as if by breath or hot air. And though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. He was startled, but he put his hand upon the key, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hall from the other side of the door. But there was nothing on the back of the door, except the screws and the nuts that held the knocker in place. And so he said, "Tiff, tiff," and closed it with a bang. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs. Slowly, too, trimming his candle as he went. It was pretty dark, but up Scrooge went, not caring a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, a small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and a little saucepan of gruel. Scrooge had a cold in his head. Upon the hob, nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in. Double locked himself in, which was not his custom to do. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers, and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed. Nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it before he could track the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago and paved all around with quaint Dutch tiles designed to illustrate the scriptures. Yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came and swallowed up the whole. "Humbug," said Scrooge, and walked across the room. After several turns, he sat down again. His glance happened to rest upon the disused bell that hung in the room. With inexplicable dread, he saw the bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute or a minute, but it seemed like an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun. They were succeeded by a clanking noise, deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder, on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His color changed, though, when without a pause it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost," and fell again. The same face, the very same Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights, and boots. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys and padlocks, ledgers and deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent. "What do you want with me?" "Much." Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley." "Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully. "I can." "Then do it." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. "You don't believe me," observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, or a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than grave about you, whatever you are." At this, the spirit raised a frightful cry and shook its chains with such a dismal and appealing noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling into the swoon. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. "Mercy," he said. "Dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?" "Man of worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" "I do," said Scrooge. "I must. But why do spirits walk the earth?" "It is required of every man," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide, and if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Oh, woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth and turned to happiness." Again the spectre raised his cry, and shook its chains and wrung its shadow hands. "You are fettered," said Scrooge, trembling. "Tell me why." "I wear the chain I forged in life," replied the ghost. "I made it link by link, and yard by yard. I girded it on my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is it pattern strange to you?" Scrooge trembled more and more. "Or would you know," pursued the ghost, "the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself, Scrooge? It was a full as heavy and as long as this 7 Christmases Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain of yours, Scrooge." Scrooge glanced about him on the floor, but he could see nothing. "Jacob," he said imploringly, "speak comfort to me, man." "I have none to give," the ghost replied. "It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers. Nor can I tell you what I would. In life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me. 7 years dead, 7 years dead, mused Scrooge. "And traveling all the time?" "The whole time," said the ghost. "No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse." "O captive bound and double-ironed," cried the phantom, "to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life opportunities misused. Yet such was I, oh, such was I." "But you were always a good businessman, Jacob." "Business?" cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. Oh!" It held up its chain at arm's length, as if that were the cause of all its unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again. "At this time of the rolling year," the spectre said, "I suffer the most. Why do I walk through the crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them that blessed star which led the wise men to the poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me?" Scrooge was very much dismayed and began to quake exceedingly. "Hear me," cried the ghost. "My time nearly gone." "I will," said Scrooge, "but don't be hard upon me." "I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day. There is no light part of my penance," pursued the ghost. "I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate. A chance and hope of my pure procuring, Ebenezer." "You were always a good friend to me," said Scrooge. "You will be haunted," resumed the ghost, "by 3 spirits. Scrooge's countenance fell. "Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob?" he demanded in a faltering voice. "It is." "I think I'd rather not," said Scrooge. "Without their visits," said the ghost, "you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bells toll 1. "Couldn't I take them all at once and have it over with, Jacob?" "Expect the second on the second night at the same hour. The third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that for you and your own sake you remember what has passed between us." With its chain wound over and about its arm, the apparition walked backwards from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped. He became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings and inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge followed to the window. Desperate in his curiosity, he looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had quite familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat, with a monstrous iron safe attached to its ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with her infant, whom it saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them all was clearly that they sought to interfere for good in human matters and had lost the power forever. These creatures faded into the mist. They and their spirit voices faded together. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was still double locked, as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable, and being much in need of repose, went straight to bed without undressing and fell asleep in an instant. And we'll stop there, and I'll catch up on the next round of the story soon. Thank you.